morning, Green Meadow. I've been interested in knives for as long as I can remember. I love fine materials and design, and knives are the perfect marriage of both. Plus, they're very useful. At some point in middle school, I carved a knife out of wood. Here. That was my first step towards making a knife. And I actually sharpened it a couple of days ago, and it did cut through some vegetables, which I'm very proud of. For several years, I've wanted to make a real knife, but it didn't evolve into a real possibility until it came time to decide what I wanted to do for my senior project. I settled on knife making very quickly, so I started searching for a mentor. I searched and searched and searched, but I was unsuccessful. I was about to give up, but then during a private lesson with my cello teacher, my teacher told me that she knew of a knife maker called Jeff Bader, who actually has a shop in the area. So I looked him up and contacted him, and it turned out that his shop was just 5 minutes from my house, so I got really lucky. Within a week, I was working at his shop, and we got along very well. We decided that I would work for him for several months, and at the same time learn all of the skills that I would need to make my own knife. The knives that my mentor makes are all custom, meaning that when a customer places an order, he will begin making the knife, and he will make it exactly how they want. He does have some standards though. He won't make ridiculous ornamental machetes or anything like that. He prefers to make real usable knives. At his shop, I worked on fixed blades only, meaning no folding pocket knives. I worked on many different types of knives, but they all fall into 2 categories: culinary knives and bushcraft knives. Here I have some examples of chef's knives, which are of course culinary. My mentor made all of these, and I worked on several of them. Here's an oyster knife, that's a bestseller. And then 2 bushcraft knives. The knives that my mentor makes and that I worked on are not fancy or gimmicky. They don't involve any really fancy materials like ebony or tusks of a walrus, or I don't know what. But there's certainly no cheaply made commercial knives either. They're somewhere right in the middle, with a perfect balance of beauty and utility. There are innumerable correct ways of making a knife. It is possible to make one using only common tools such as a saw, a drill, a file, and sandpaper. But to actually harden the steel and make a good knife, you do need a forge or a kiln. Power tools can help speed up the process exponentially. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have commercial knives, which are made by robots and high-tech machines controlled by computers. Again, the knives I worked on are the middle ground. I did work with many power tools, such as a belt sander, a disc grinder, a drill press, a bandsaw, but I also used many manual tools such as a file and sandpaper. Each step that was involved in making my knife and the knives I worked on did require some manual precision, so nothing happens automatically, and it is possible to mess up at any given point. Making a knife using my mentor's method and my method takes around 15 hours on average, although it can take longer, and that's if you're very efficient and you know what you're doing. For my knife, I opted to use a stock removal method as opposed to forging it. Stock removal is when you take material off of a piece of steel using power tools, whereas forging is hammering a piece of steel into a shape. I started working on my design several months ago, at which point I had only the design in mind, not how difficult it would be to make it and how practical it would be. Here are some preliminary designs and just crazy designs. And here is one of the first designs of the knife I did end up making. although it evolved and got much nicer, which you'll see later. After I designed my knife, it was time to choose the materials. There are two main kinds of steel used for a knife: stainless steel and carbon steel. I chose stainless steel because it stains and rusts much less easily, and it's also a little bit softer than carbon steel, so it's easier to sharpen, although it goes a little bit faster. I made my handle out of koa wood. Of course, there are hundreds of other materials you can make a handle out of, but I really like that wood is natural, and I love how it looks and feels. I didn't film the process of making my knife because it would have been very impractical and time-consuming, so I made a second knife just for the purpose of the videos I'm about to show you. That knife is actually a fake knife because I made it out of soft steel, so it does function like any other knife, but it will dull very quickly, and it's not that usable. I used a very simple design so that the videos aren't too complicated. It was already very difficult to cut several hours down into 5 minutes or so. So I tried to keep it very simple. Don't worry though, I'll show you photos of my real knife after these photos. Here I'm cutting out the rough outline of the knife using the bandsaw. The result is really rough, so I'm going to have to clean it up and smooth it out on the belt sander. Now that it's nice and smooth, it's time for the next step, making the choil, the file work, and the jimping. Here I'm filing the choil in, whose purpose is basically to look cool, although it also helps make the knife a little bit easier to sharpen. Here I'm making the file work, which is purely decorative. That's on the back of the handle. And here I'm using a checking file to create the jimping, which is a grip for your thumb as you're holding the knife. And there's the finished spine of the knife. Here I'm grinding the bevels. This is a process which is very easy to mess up because you can get the angle wrong if you just turn it a little bit, and getting the bevels even is quite difficult. But it turned out all right. Here are 4 basic grinds. I chose the flat grind on the left, which is the simplest of them all, but it works well, it's efficient. Next, I'm going to drill holes in the tang of the knife, which is the handle portion. So first I mark where I'm going to make the holes with a Sharpie. Then I use a center punch and a hammer to make dents so that the drill bit has something to bite into. The 2 holes at the ends of the knife are for pins to go through to fasten the handle, and all of the other holes are for weight reduction so that the handle isn't too heavy, so that the knife is balanced. As you can see, burrs form around each of the holes, making the tang uneven, so I have to get rid of the burrs using a countersink bit. I'm not sure why one of the weight reduction holes ended up hexagonal, but it happened. It's okay. After that, it's time to heat treat the knife. This is probably the most important part of making a knife. There are many different methods of heat treating, but the basic idea is that you heat the knife up somewhere between 1000 and 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on what kind of steel you have. And at that critical temperature, the carbides in the steel will go into solution, which reinforces the structure of the steel a lot. Then once it's at that temperature for a few minutes, you shock the knife by quenching it, cooling it down very quickly, and it retains that strong structure. Here I'm demonstrating a common heat treating method for carbon steel. So I'll leave it in there for a few minutes, and once it's hot enough, I dip it in oil to quench it. Heat treating often causes some nice colors to appear on the blade, but unfortunately those disappear as I continue to work on the knife. After heat treating, it's time to temper the knife, because the steel, although it becomes very hard from heat treatment, it also becomes very brittle. So we have to make it more flexible by tempering it, which means bringing it up to around 400 degrees for a couple of hours. So again, that results in the steel being a little bit softer, but much more flexible, so it has the right balance. After tempering, I grind the bevels to their final dimensions on the disc grinder. As you can see, the blade is very beaten up after the disc grinder, so I have to counter that by hand sanding, which is the most time-consuming part of making a knife. It takes around 2 hours for a knife if you're efficient, but it's definitely worth it. And here I'm using a chef's knife to demonstrate, because it's a little bit more striking. This is a time lapse of an hour or so for one side, and the finish is nice. Next, it's time to work on the scales. The scales are the two halves of the handle that go around the metal part. So here I'm cutting the rough outline of the scales using the bandsaw. Next, I drill the 2 holes for the pins to go through. But I'm going to have to use a countersink bit to make wider openings at both sides of the holes, because I am going to use Corby bolts to fasten the handle together, and they look like this. The process of gluing the handle together using epoxy is very complicated and boring, so we'll skip that. Now, once that the knife is all glued together, I cut down the Corby bolts so that they're flush with the scales. Then I smooth the sides of the scales. Then I get rid of any excess wood, because as you can remember, it was very rough, the outline of the handle, so now I get rid of all of that extra wood. And then there are many hard angles on the handle, so I get rid of those, kind of rounding it. Then it's time to finish up the handle, first using a file, also to get all the lines going in one direction on the metal. And then I use sandpaper to give the knife a nice smooth feel. And once it's all sanded, I apply some wax to make it feel nicer and give it a nice finish. And there's the finished handle. It's finally time for the last step, and probably the most satisfying, because you know you're about to use your knife and test it out on some paper, sharpening. Here's a picture of the Keep in mind this is my fake knife, so it's alright, but the details are much less nice than the other knife. And you can see here the file work, which you saw me making earlier. Now it stands out with the epoxy in it. This is a little kiridashi, which is just a small Japanese style knife. This one I forged using only an anvil and a hammer, besides blade itself, which I use the power tool for. And this is my real knife in its sheath. You can see the koa wood that I use. Again, the file wood on the right over there. And here is the complete collection. On the bottom, my real knife. On the right, my fake knife. At the top, the little kirdashi. And on the left, it's a bigger forged knife, which is a work in progress. I still have quite a ways to go with that one. And here's my knife next to the original design. And finally, just for fun, me testing the knife out. I have to thank Jeff, my mentor, for just helping me out a ridiculous amount and teaching me basically everything I know about knives. Mr. Davis, thank you for helping me a lot with my speech. Cole, thank you for lending me your camera to shoot these videos and even coming in one day to help me shoot. Thank you, Joseph, for all of your hours working on the tech. Thank you to my parents for always supporting me, and my class for being awesome. I forgot, here are my, I don't know if you'll be able to see them.
We'll put them out. Hold them up.
Yeah, well, they'll be on display at the end, so I have, here is my first wooden knife. Small kirdashi, which I forged.
Tiny.
I forgot to mention, I also made the sheaths out of kydex, which is a kind of a really durable plastic. This is the work in progress that I'm forging. The video knife, the fake knife. And the rubber knife.
Wow.
Any questions? Yeah. Okay, well, I don't think this one is so important. The video knife I tried to make very quickly so that the videos wouldn't be too long. I'd say in total it probably took around, usually a knife like this should take 15, but it was soft steel, it was a bit easier to work with. And this knife, I worked on the details just a ridiculous amount, so probably around 30 hours. Yeah.
Are you ever going to make more knives and sell them?
I don't think I'll sell them because it's really a very time-consuming process, and as I make it, I fall in love with the knife, and then I really don't want to get rid of it. I would like to make more at some point. Probably not very soon, but one day I'd like to maybe have a workshop and make them as a hobby. Yeah.
What do you plan to do with the knives?
Well, use them, but safely. I don't want to damage them too much, especially since I have one working one. I don't want to mess it up. Yeah.
Did you learn something? Well, I'm sure you learned many things, but what surprised you most that you learned about yourself in the process of making these knives?
Well, I really like manual labor and repetitive manual labor. I like the kind of mindset that it puts me in, of concentration, and I can see myself doing that a lot more. Grace?
Did you get cut a lot?
Yeah, a few times. When I finished this knife, like 3 days ago, as soon as I sharpened it, I cut myself pretty badly, and it went for many hours, but nothing like really bad.
How much is your knife worth?
I don't plan on selling it. It could probably go for, I don't know, like $500 to $700, something like that. Those,
like on here.
oh, on those are my mentor's initials, Jeff Bader. And he has his logo, he stamps it on the knives.
That last real knife, is there a specific meaning for it? Is it a specific type, and what would you use it for?
Well, see, when I was designing it, I just had the design in mind. I didn't think about what I'd use it for. I just wanted to make a cool looking knife.
Aside from cutting watermelon.
Yeah, so it can be used as a bushcraft knife, like, I don't know, just whittling random twigs, I guess. Or, of course, it can be used as a little kitchen knife, like a paring knife, if I want to do that. I'll probably use it for some cutting boxes, just anything. Nothing.